I see it.
Yay! Hello, everyone. My name is Dora Diaz. Welcome to the Osceola Democrats, and I am here with Ryan Williams. He is he's running for state attorney, um, Circuit 9, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
How are you?
I'm doing really good.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Awesome, awesome. So, well, this is Spill the Tea. So with Spill the Tea, we asked our candidates, we're sharing a little bit of tea. I have some water right now. I don't have any tea, but are you drinking tea or coffee?
Coffee. So I get mercilessly made fun of by my wife because one of my favorite things now has become cinnamon dolce K cups from Starbucks. So
That's really
I,
good.
there for a while I was intermittent fasting, and which means black coffee. I had to get used to black coffee. So with the pandemic campaign and work, I decided there's only so much you can take. So so I have coffee tonight.
Oh, that's brave. I'm gonna enjoy this one.
Right.
That's really good.
It's the
I
little
love it.
things.
Huh?
It's the
I
little
think
things
I was
in
telling
life.
I was just telling earlier that I was at my grandma's house. Everyone at my grandma's house right now. This is not my usual setup, but she makes like really delicious café con leche. Oh,
Hmm.
so thank you, abuela. All right, so Ryan Williams, I don't really know what's your story. What are you doing right now? What can we know about you?
Okay, so I grew up in Central Florida. There's not a lot of us who are here by birth. So I actually grew up in South Lake County and went to South Lake High School. I went to Rollins College for undergraduate and played soccer there, which is to say that I was a walk-on, so I watched a lot of soccer. But I stayed all 4 years, and then I went to the University of North Carolina Law School at Chapel Hill.
Oh,
I,
sweet.
yep, my you can see the banner in the back. My wife and I have been married for 17 years in July,
Oh,
uh,
congratulations.
but I've known her since we were in the third grade, and we started dating in high school. So
Wow.
we have two kids that are 7 and 5. The oldest is Kennedy, she's 7, and the youngest is Lincoln, who's 5. And that was not intentional to name them both after presidents. It kind of worked out that way. So I currently prosecute cases on behalf of the Fifth Judicial Circuit.
Okay.
I was a prosecutor in the Ninth Circuit, which is the office I'm running for just about a decade. And in 2017, I left the Fifth Circuit and was assigned to prosecute the capital cases that had been removed by the governor.
Yes. Yes.
So now I currently only prosecute first degree murder cases, almost all of which, with the exception of an Osceola County case that we just picked up, are capital cases.
Okay. So, when our our governor he took away that the capital punishment cases from Ayala,
Mhm.
then you took over in the Fifth District. Is that correct?
That's right. So Brad King, who's the state attorney of the Fifth Circuit, hired me to prosecute those cases and work for him. It's a very weird setup because I'm paid and employed by the Fifth Circuit and directed, but my office is actually in the Ninth Circuit. We have a team of people who work on the Orange and Osceola County cases, and that largely came about because I was already handling about 3 or 4 of them. So I knew the victims and their families, and it was a more seamless transition for me.
Okay. So for as part of like the Osceola Democrats, we are trying to give a platform to for us to know what these offices do and more just explaining it like, hey, this is what each race does, this is what they're in charge of. So what does a state attorney do and who can vote for you in the ninth district?
Excellent question. It's not as easy as it sounds. So most people, when they hear state attorney, particularly, I know we have a lot of New Yorker transplants in Central Florida. They think that it's for the whole state of Florida, but it's actually more like district attorney.
Mm-hmm.
So the Ninth Judicial Circuit is Orange and Osceola County, and the state attorney is responsible for prosecuting every single criminal case that happens in Orange and Osceola County. So more than 50,000 cases go through the Ninth Circuit every year. There are more than 170 assistant state attorneys or prosecutors that work in the office, and the staff is more than 370 people. So I've been a prosecutor. I was a prosecutor in the Ninth for about a decade, and now I'm running to lead the office.
Wow, that's insane. It's just so many cases, and just especially because this area, especially Osceola and Orange County, is one of the fastest growing counties in Florida. So that caseload must be really large for that office, you know.
It is. It's not only that there's a lot of people here, but you also have to remember that the tourism industry really impacts that in the cases, because we have victims, unfortunately, from all over the world, and they come in from other places, and the number of people that we have coming through the county increases our numbers even more.
Oh, I really didn't think about that. Like, since we're such a really big tourist central like place, so that is really interesting to learn. Um, so now, is this a partisan race? You're running as a Democrat, correct?
It is a partisan race. It's strange because it's really not a partisan, or shouldn't be, in my opinion, a partisan position. But it is a partisan race. Qualifying was finishing or closed April 24th, and there are 4 Democrats and 1 NPA that are running for state attorney in the Ninth Circuit.
Thank you. And why should us young Democrats, specifically for those 40 and under, why should we support your campaign?
Well, if you want to talk numbers, I am the youngest candidate.
Yay!
By a little bit, even though most of the people who know me say I've been 40 since I was 18. I would say because the face of prosecution is changing, and the way we do prosecution is changing. We as a society are still paying for the sins of our criminal justice system 10, 15, 20 years ago, when racism was more prevalent, still prevalent, but when it was more prevalent than it is now. Sometimes it was overt, and mistakes were made. And I'm sure who's familiar with crime scene shows or even media today knows people were wrongly convicted. And we have to make sure going forward that we have an office and a criminal justice system that is sensitive not to wrongful convictions, but also to some of the challenges that we are asked to take on. So, for example, convicted felons, being a convicted impacts more than liberty. It impacts right to vote, which of course has been a big deal here in the state of Florida within the last few years. And state attorneys have a role to play in making sure that we don't make convicted felons of people who shouldn't be or don't need to be. And B, if we are convicted felons, I think there's a role for us to play to try to help those people have their rights restored. So I firmly believe that I've been thinking about and know these issues that are confronting younger people that are now thinking about the criminal justice system for the first time better than anyone else in the race.
Thank you. And I'm just curious, this is a very simple question, but many people have different perspectives on this. But what does justice mean to you? And like, how is that similar to what justice means to marginalized communities? What does it look like in practice?
To me, justice is the right thing under the specific circumstances. So it's one thing to say, do the right thing. Well, what does that mean? Because the right thing can mean different things for different people. And as a prosecutor, my big goal is always to make sure that we make sure justice is individualized. In other words, while you have to have policies and procedures because you want consistency in how people are treated, every person and situation and human are different. And we need to make sure that we recognize those differences and that our interpretation and execution of the law considers that fact. That is very hard when you have 50,000 cases. I know unequivocally, because I've done the job and I'm doing the job, that when you are confronted with 100 felony cases or 200 felony cases and you're one person, it's really difficult to give that individualized attention, but that's our task. And that's what, to me, justice means. And you mentioned marginalized communities. It is, I think this is part of having a younger perspective on the office. Uh, I recognize that our criminal justice system, even if it is no longer overtly, I don't want to use the word racist, if it does not have overt outcomes, overt intentions, the outcomes have disparate impact on Black and brown communities, right? So we need to step beyond, well, we don't need to have racist prosecutors. Of course we don't. We need to start thinking about, well, how do the systems and the processes that we have in place prevent us from being equal and equally applying the law? And that's the task that I think young prosecutors and frankly new state attorneys have to start to really confront and answer those questions.
And I think that's very important at this time. There's a lot of in this pandemic, there's been a lot of racial tensions in the state and in the state of Florida, and so it's very important that justice is served. Especially in those marginalized communities, being represented well.
Right.
So, thank you for saying that. But what does restorative justice mean specifically to you?
Well, there's the theory of restorative justice that they teach in school.
Mm-hmm.
And you asked me what it means to me. To me, it means people that encounter the criminal justice system can leave as whole as possible when it's over, when their experience is over. And again, that's a hard thing. So one of the things that people don't know about me, because I'm a white male who went to a couple of very good schools, and I prosecute murder cases and sometimes death penalty cases.
Mm-hmm.
But I am also the son of a convicted felon. So my dad is actually in prison, in federal prison.
Wow.
And that's important. I say that because I've actually sat on both sides of the courtroom. I've sat with victims, and that's where I normally sit, but I know what it is to sit in the audience behind a loved one, and to have the gamut of emotions that go through that. In other words, there's the shame of being associated with it. There's the fear of what's going to happen to that person. So restorative justice to me is a system of justice where the defendant pays his or her due or debt to society, but is also that debt has to be equal to what the crime was, and then we need to be able to allow them to move on with their lives. And the same thing for the victims. The victims, unfortunately, there's very few things that I can do in most instances to make the victim whole, but we can get farther than we have in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you're the victim of a violent crime, I can never undo that injustice for a victim, but we can give them as much healing and resources and opportunities, to allow them to move on with their lives. What I've found prosecuting cases is that just knowing that justice, whatever that is for in a specific situation, was done, really allows people to start to heal. Like, unfortunately, our criminal justice system takes a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And there are reasons for that, and some of them are good and some of them are not. But my experience is people don't even really start to heal from being victimized until that process ends. So when I think about restorative justice, my concept of it is, how do we help the defendant, the victim, and then the larger community still needs to feel safe despite the fact that
Yes.
this happened. And that, that's not easy. I guess I'll put it that way, to do that in every case. But that's our goal, and that's what we're going to try to do if I'm elected.
Thank you. And so then what are your opinions on the Amendment 4 and the current lawsuit regarding this Florida Supreme Court?
So I don't want to say that I've had a conversion because this goes back to the age and the gap in criminal justice and how it's changing. When I was younger, when I was fresh out of law school, it was a given that if you got convicted of a felony, you couldn't vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to hear about the need to allow felons to have their rights restored, not through the the very cumbersome process that currently, or that existed pre-Amendment 4. And I started to think to myself, well, why do we take their right to vote? And frankly, Dora, there's not a good answer to that. To me, one is not associated with the other. And particularly once somebody has paid their debt to society, I feel like they should have all their rights restored, including the right to vote. And that's what Amendment 4, I think, was intended to do. Now, I've actually read a little bit about the lawsuit. I've had an opportunity to briefly meet Mr. Mead, who's one of the people who really spearheaded the effort across the state, Desmond Mead, and his group. It gets complicated when you start talking about restitution owed to victims. I'll tell you that if particularly financial crimes, if a person is convicted of a crime and they owe a victim money, I feel like that money needs to be paid before their right is restored. However, I don't think that fees and fines, which are usually much higher as a result of interest rates being charged by collection agencies, that shouldn't have any place in the rights restoration. So I believe I support the restoration of rights in Amendment 4 the way it was intended, because my understanding of what Mr. Mead has said is victims need to be restored, but once that happens, people need their right, and they need the right to vote. And I personally think that the fees and interest charged by these collection agencies are outrageous. Now, this is part of government. Those fees fund our system, right? Because the legislature doesn't. So if you're going to address that, you have to address the other. As you can see, just like everything in government, everything is tied together.
Yes.
But my, for lack of a better term, moral judgment and personal judgment is that the right to vote is sacrosanct. We can't even get half of our citizens who have the right to exercise it. So if people have paid their debt and turned their lives around and want to vote, we need to make it as easy as possible for them to do so.
That is true. That is true. And how's your, well, I know, keeping on that, like, how's your campaign? I know we're right now, we're staying indoors with social distancing. How's your campaign, like, trying to, how has that changed now that we're indoors and we are not social distancing? You can't just do the traditional canvassing. Yes, phone banking a lot more, but what has your campaign done to make sure that you tell people to vote for you?
So this is really like in the weeds, but you asked, so I'll say it. We knew early on that, Orange and Osceola County it's a giant place.
Yes.
And as a Democrat who works on campaigns or has, I'm sure you know how much it costs to send one piece of mail to every person. I think in a Democratic primary, you'd be talking somewhere around $75,000 for one piece of mail for the two counties. So we knew early that was going to be unrealistic. We've really focused on digital advertising and social media, knowing that a large portion of the population gets their news from social media. So starting way back when we began our campaign more than a year ago, we really started to focus on digital content. And we've built up a bank of that digital content. To your point, now is the time when campaigns traditionally start to really reach out to voters. And you said it, we are on the phone. I was making calls before I got on this call with you. I've blocked off an hour every day at the end of my day to make those phone calls. We have a lot of volunteers that are going to be making those phone calls as well. So those are the two primary means of communication that we've set up. Our race, for a long time, Dora, nobody cared who the state attorney was. And people just sort of stayed there. Lawson Lamar was state attorney of the Ninth Circuit for 20 years. And now it's like everybody wants to be state attorney and everybody really focuses on the state attorney's race. Part of that is media driven because unfortunately crime is important in the media, in the public eye.
Yeah.
But I say that because I know that there's already 3 debates planned amongst our candidates. I suspect that there'll be a few more. Some of them early on will be on the internet and others will be coming later. So that's our plan, is to really be focused on reaching people through social media and non-traditional outlets, and then be on the phone, because nothing can really replace those one-to-one contacts with voters.
Thank you. Thank you. I actually didn't know there was going to be a debate. So that is, I want to keep an eye out for that when that time comes. Thank you.
So on May 28th, there's a debate sponsored by, I want to say Freedom for All, and that's online.
Okay.
On June 11th, it's a debate sponsored by a bunch of groups, but the one that people will recognize is the ACLU is co-sponsoring that debate. And then the Orange County Bar Association and Tiger Bay are co-sponsoring a forum on July 23rd of this year.
All right. Well, thank you. Listen up, viewers. Hope you wrote down those dates. Well, let's get back to the nitty gritty. So what steps should we be taking towards criminal justice reform in Florida?
I think there's a couple of not easy ones, but ones where there's bipartisan agreement. Unfortunately, that it didn't come to fruition in the legislature this year the way I had hoped. The first one is elimination of a lot of minimum mandatories. So for people who don't know what that is, those are sentences for specific crimes where if you're convicted, where the judge must sentence you to a specific minimum term of years and there's no discretion. The big one that I've come out against, and in fact came out against almost a decade ago, was trafficking. So what people don't understand, a lot of people, is that if you possess certain drugs, even if you're not selling them or there's no evidence that you're selling them, if you possess a certain amount of it, then you're considered to be trafficking in drugs. And the situation that happens often is a person gets addicted to prescription pills.
Okay.
They end up getting a pill bottle that doesn't belong to them with somebody else, and 50 pills. And next thing you know, we'll just say oxycodone.
Okay.
They could face a 25-year minimum sentence.
Wow.
For those pills. And that's not fair. It doesn't take into account the individual circumstances of addiction, right? So I think we need to address that legislation. There were several bills in the legislature to eliminate those, and unfortunately, that didn't pass. Another thing to keep an eye on is juvenile justice reform. Senator Randolph Bracey, a local elected official here in Central Florida, had a bill to define child as anyone 12 or under, and to prohibit arrest of children under the age of 12, with some rare exceptions like things like murder, of course. And I support that bill because I mean my kids are 75, and the idea that someone would put handcuffs on them at school makes me physically ill. So those are just a couple of the reforms that are out there. The other one that I would point out is increased use of diversionary programs. So for those who aren't aware, diversion means you get arrested or accused of a crime, and rather than going through the system, you basically like do a form of probation where you take care of certain tasks, whether it be community service or drug treatment or whatever, and then your case goes away. It's like it never happened. Yeah, you divert away from the criminal justice system. And one of my goals, one of the things that I would do is, there are diversionary programs in Orange County right now, but they haven't been updated in nearly 10 years. And we need to make them available to a wider range of crimes and to a broader range of people. So right now, if you've got a previous conviction, you're not eligible for diversion. And that's one of the strictures that I want to remove. For example, let's say that you committed even a violent crime 25 years ago, and then you pick up a petty theft, right?
Okay.
Violent crime 25 years ago, when you're a totally different person, prevents you from having diversion now? In my view, no. But that goes back to that individualized. Make it available, and then you allow the facts to dictate what the decision is.
That is, I'm new to this, like new to a lot of, and I didn't know about this diversion program. So that is a really interesting fact that I really want to look into. So thank you. And is the cash bail system, so when working, how is it effective? How is it ineffective? And how is the state attorney, how do they address this and the issues with it?
That's a big one, and thank you for bringing it up. Cash bond unequivocally has an impact, a disparate impact on people of Black and brown communities and lower socioeconomic means, right? I think that's kind of obvious because they don't have money and that's what it's based upon. The trick is to figure out how you accomplish the goal of getting people to court while not having that money over them. So, my perception, Dora, is that people think the state attorney can do more than he or she can. So I know that Aramis Ayala, who's the current state attorney, made an announcement about a year ago, I think, maybe 2 years ago, that there would be no more cash bond in Orange County. And I applaud the idea. But what I know, and what I'll tell anybody watching or who will watch this, is prosecutors don't set bond. The judges do.
Mm-hmm.
Even if a prosecutor says, Judge, we don't want a bond, the judge has a separate independent responsibility to make sure that person appears. And in fact, the Orlando Sentinel read an article about a year ago, about a year after the announcement, saying basically that people are still getting cash bond. So what do we do about that? The answer can be found in what some other states have tried to do. So New Jersey is an example. In 2017, New Jersey tried to do away with cash bond. And what they basically did was adopted a system for pretrial release. Basically, those are like, I'll use the term probation officers. They're officers that are employed by the state who an arrestee checks in with on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
They did things like use technology. So they sent text messages to arrestees, letting them know when their court dates were, reminding them about certain things. Really positive program, and they had a lot of success. They reduced the number of people in local jails by 35%.
Wow.
Which I completely applaud. It was a $50 million program across the state. So again, it comes down to who's going to pay for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I view my role as state attorney to make sure that our local county officials, because the county would be largely responsible for that tab, that they support that and that they budget for that, and we push for those resources. Because while I don't want people to be in jail because they can't afford bail when others can, because that's not fair, the reality is, again, this is a nuance of the criminal justice system. If you have a court date and you're a defendant and you miss it, the current practice is for the judge to issue a warrant for your arrest. And most practically, usually what happens, because the statute says it can, is there's a no bond attached to that, which means that you will be arrested and the judge will not have to give you a bond ever, which means you can sit in jail until your case comes to trial or you have to enter a plea. And that's not good either, right? So we have to collectively have the will to deal with this issue of making sure we have a program in place to have people appear that's not based on money, but not just saying, well, we're just okay with people not coming to court, because when they don't, there are consequences.
Wow, that's interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
So one of our, now we try to, as Osceola Democrats, we're trying to push for, better education. We're trying to push for environmental sustainability. So now what kind of environmental justice can you exert if elected? And do you feel it's important that the state attorney focus on environmental protection? Just like at the state of Florida right now, what are your thoughts on that?
It doesn't come up a lot in the state attorney's role. And I'll tell you a couple reasons why. First of all, unfortunately, there has not been a big appetite for prosecuting people who violate environmental laws. Secondly, there aren't a lot of environmental laws that are criminal in nature, which is one reason why people feel free, in my opinion, to break the law, because it's usually large corporations who have tons of money and they build those fines, those civil fines, into the cost of doing business. The other reason is that broad scale pollution is usually handled on a multi-jurisdictional basis. And there's actually a specific office that works for the Attorney General, the Office of Statewide Prosecution, who handles that. Now, all that said, again, my kids are young and I want them to be able to go for a jog in 20 years without having to wear a mask.
Mhm.
Our air is so dirty. I'm actually one of the few people who I think have prosecuted an environmental case. There was a situation when I was a young prosecutor where there was a group of city employees who were accused of dumping public waste, or human waste, I should say, in certain places within the city of Maitland. Wrap your mind around that.
Oh,
Um, but I did in fact prosecute those crimes, and I would be more than willing to make sure that if an environmental crime comes up in our jurisdiction, that it would be treated appropriately. But frankly, it just doesn't come up a whole lot in my role.
thank you, thank you. And just, I know you're looking over, watching over like Osceola and Orange County. How, like, what is the differences in how you approach the cases in each county?
Good question. Excellent question.
Thank you.
The I'll tell you my observations because I worked in the Osceola County office. Wasn't a long time, and it was early in my career. But Osceola County is starting to change and become much more like Orange. And
Mhm.
by that I mean increased crime, much more diverse population. Right. I'm aware of a time that Osceola County was largely older and whiter, right, than it is now. Um, and they're starting to develop a lot of the organized crime issues that Orange County had. So my goal as state attorney would be to make sure that we fund and staff the Osceola County office and treat it equitably with Orange. Um, my observation over the last decade, particularly in the time that I was working there, is that the state attorney's office in Osceola County actually has an office for the state attorney, the elected state attorney.
Mhm.
If you run your finger across that desk, there's dust about 5 inches thick because the state attorney never goes down there. Through unusual circumstances, I've spent a fair amount of time in Osceola County because I was the prosecutor who handled the murder of the two Kissimmee Police Department officers. The trial went forward back in August. So I've become a lot more familiar with the area and the county and some of the specific issues that the county is dealing with. So my goal is to make sure that those growing pains, that which will include an increase in crime and probably violent crime, are met, and that we can sort of equalize the treatment out between the two offices.
Interesting. And so now, do you guys have a role as a state attorney? Does the state attorney have a role in like practice, like protecting vulnerable communities, like poor neighborhoods, immigrants, LGBT communities, and how does that do that? Or what's your experience in that?
Well, I would say there's two sort of ways that it comes up in our profession. One of which is to make sure that individuals are not victimized because of who they are. And the term hate crime is the one that most people will use. Um, we need to make sure we deal with hate crimes quickly and swiftly to make sure that the population generally understands, like most of us, that that's unacceptable.
Mhm.
From a bigger perspective, stepping back, I feel like we need to be, as an office, much more involved and engaged in our underserved communities for a couple of reasons. Number one, those communities, unfortunately, are the ones that are going to need us the most. Black and brown and poor communities have higher incidence and rates of crime, and they're the ones who will be, their citizens will be victims of crime that we really need to protect. But of course, those communities also have the most fear of law enforcement because they are heavily policed. So how do you square that? You, like any relationship, it takes time and effort and understanding. It takes going into those communities and saying, this is what we do. There's no need to be scared of us. We are, in fact, going to protect you if you come forward and report crime. Because remember, a lot of people in those communities, they may be victims, particularly illegal immigrants, are victims of crime, but they don't want to come forward for fear of being deported or for
Mhm.
fear of retaliation. So we need to make sure that we address that head on by communicating with those communities and frankly, by doing our job effectively in those cases so that when other people that are of similar backgrounds have that experience, they know they can rely upon us. So one specific idea that I've had and talked about for some time now is that assigning a specific prosecutor to a geographic area where he or she can really get to know the citizens of that community. So that prosecutor is basically like, you want to break it down by zip code, right?
Yeah.
It would depend on the zip code and how many cases, but say they wanted to be responsible for a St. Cloud zip code.
Okay.
So, and they're responsible for every crime that comes out of there. Well, they get to know who the drug dealers are. They get to know who the elderly people on the street corner are who see everything and can actually give them information. And they build relationships by going out in the community with law enforcement and letting them know that they're there for them. And eventually, I believe those relationships will allow us to remove the bad actors from that community, which are usually a small number of people who are particularly problematic, and allow everybody else to be safe. But that's a practical way to build that relationship and try to protect underserved communities.
Interesting. Very interesting, because that would reach, you would build that relationship in one of those, one of the best ways to get to know the community is to have those relationships with these people. And if you're working with the same group of people, then in the zip code, for example, then you get to build stronger communities. I see what you're saying.
Well, and it's not Osceola County, but it is the Ninth Circuit. And I've made it clear that two of the areas that I'm looking at to do that would be south of Popka, which is largely African American, and Pine Hills, which of course has a ton of crime. I don't think you could do all of Pine Hills, but I think you could get an area of it where you could start to gain the community's trust and help them help themselves.
Yes, and then they talk, and people talk within each other, so they would know. Right. Interesting. And how is it like right now? So how would you? What type of changes are you trying to make? Are you making in the state attorney office? Like, what are the major changes what's the number one change that once you get in there, what would you do?
The number one thing, and it's not exciting, is we need to retain prosecutors. Okay. So we have 160, or there are approximately 160 attorneys in the state attorney's office. In 2019, 60 of them resigned.
Wow.
Meaning, right. So close to a third, somewhere between a third and a half of the workforce turned over. Now, anybody who's worked at any job knows that if 1/3 of your coworkers left in a year, that would cause some serious problems. The prosecutors are exceptionally young and inexperienced, and they're also overwhelmed. And we need to make the office a better place to work and give them the tools they need so that we can keep those people and create some stability. Because the other thing that happens besides losing experience is when somebody leaves, somebody else has to pick up that case. And what's ended up happening is victims of crime are having to get introduced to 3 and 4 prosecutors during the course of a 6-month to 18-month criminal process. And that really shakes their confidence in our system. So not to mention the economic waste of having to train and retrain people over and over again. So retaining good prosecutors is high on my list of being able to take a first step to turn the office around.
Wow. And how would you, what type of ways, what would you implement to retain these prosecutors? What type of changes would you make?
We need to train them better and give them training and policies and a specific, anybody who started a new job knows that one of the worst things that can happen is you're sort of thrown a bunch of responsibilities and not told how to go about carrying them out.
Yeah, very true.
Go wait on these 10 tables. Well, I've never been a waiter before. Well, you'll figure it out. It doesn't work well because people get overwhelmed, and especially when you're dealing with people's lives and liberty. So we're going to train them better. We're going to also try to reduce their caseloads through a variety of methods. And then, quite frankly, Dora, we're going to be nice to them and let them know that they're appreciated. People probably don't know that prosecutors have traditionally, when I started at state attorney's office, I made $36,000 a year. I had 7 years of higher education, and I was getting paid less than my wife, who's a public school teacher.
Yes, I was about to say. I was like, that's less than
Um,
above a school
Now,
teacher.
the legislature just 2 years ago raised that to $50,000 a year, but compared to what a prosecutor can make on the open market, that's still pretty low. So
Mhm.
we also need to continue um, to lobby our elected officials, our legislators, to pay prosecutors so that they can, do a very important job in a public service, but also have a family and be able to live their lives.
Yes, yes, that is very true. And how do you plan on recruiting prosecutors, especially a diverse group of prosecutors that represents the community?
Great question. So one of the things that I will give Miss Ayala a lot of credit for is she has diversified the office. We have two two local law schools, FAMU and Barry.
Mhm.
FAMU is very diverse, and pulling from those students will help diversify the school, or the office, excuse me. But I would also personally travel to UFFSU in Miami, um, and make sure that people know, as the elected state attorney, as a person who still intends to try cases, what the job offers and that it really is a great career. I tell people all the time that I feel like I have the best job in the world. I really do. I get to get up every day and go do the right thing. Like, my client is all of you people of Orange and Osceola County. And while I of course represent your interest, I do that by doing what's in the best interest of the community. And there aren't many lawyers that can say that. Most lawyers have to represent their client, whether that's
Yeah.
good, bad, or different. So letting people know that is one of the ways that I would intend to bring good prosecutors in and keep them.
Thank you. Wow, that is very inspiring.
Good.
So our last question, and that's it, is done for the night. So what are your favorite places to spend time with in your district in Orange and Osceola County?
So I live in Winter Garden. I really enjoyed downtown Winter Garden, even though it's not very far from my house at all. Uh,
Mhm.
I love spending time in downtown Orlando. My wife and I used to live near downtown. Um, in Kissimmee, I like the waterfront park area, which of course is massively different than it was when I was down there in
Yeah.
2006. I worked there. Um, um, I also think that there's a lot of really nice, uh, I'll say, environmental areas in Osceola County where you can go and be alone, which is hard to do in downtown Orlando. But for me, when I'm not working, which is not very often, I try to spend as much time as I can with my kids. So wherever there's a pool or a playground is usually where I'll be found.
Oh, yay. That is very sweet. Well, listen, thank you so much for taking the time just to get to know you, to get to know your story. And you were our first state attorney candidate. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming out to our show. And if there's any last minute words you'd like to let our viewers know, please, this is the time. And thank you, Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan.
That's okay. I was in front of a judge for about 2 years who has become a personal friend, and he called me Mr. Ryan the entire time, even though he knows my family. The only thing I would say is thank you for the opportunity. The August primary is August 18th. If you want to even know even more about me, or maybe to get some pictures of my family, it's Ryan, RYAN, for justice.com. And I hope I'll have your vote in August.
Thank you. All right, everyone. See you later. See you next time.
Bye, Dora.
Bye.